Yeah.
This song brought to you by Diet Coke. Turn it up.
Big wheels keep on turning, carry me home to my kin, singing songs about the Southland. Miss Alabama once again, I'm processing. Sweet home Alabama, where the skies are so blue. Sweet home Alabama, Lord, I'm coming home to you.
Tell 'em true.
Hey. Hey everybody, Mr. E coming at you right now, along with Mrs. Ellsburn. She's been kind enough to help me out to introduce your next novel, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. I did post some assignments on Google Classroom for you. We're not going to rehash the introduction, the introductory prezi. You guys can do that on your own. Instead, we're going to kind of give you our own perspective on the novel, why we love it, kind of get you started with the reading. We'll read the first couple of pages with you. Instead of reading quizzes, as I posted on Google Classroom, you guys will write an essay. Each of you will write an essay as you read, introducing the novel to your parents. And we're also asking you to talk about the writing style and the emotional impact that it has on you without using the word I, and that will take the place of reading quizzes. We're going to continue to assign about 20 to 30 pages per day, and we'll wrap it up after spring break. So first up, this is a novel about Alabama, a fictional town called Macomb, Alabama, during the Depression in the 1930s. It's the story of a lawyer who is asked to defend a black man who is falsely accused of rape. The lawyer's name is Atticus Finch. The novel is told through the eyes of his 9-year-old daughter, Scout, who has a brother named Jem. Their mother died many years earlier, and this small-town lawyer is left to raise the kids on his own. And so it's really a coming-of-age story about a small town in the South. Mrs. E?
Yeah, I don't know. You covered it there.
Okay.
The only thing that I'll add is Atticus, to me, is a character that I know he's not a real person, but I always look up to him. And I think in life, a lot of times, more often than you're asked to choose between what's right and what's wrong, I think you're usually asked to choose between what's right versus what's easy. And I always say to myself, what would Atticus do? And I ask myself, what would Atticus Finch do in the situation, especially when sometimes you're trying to make the decision that you know is going to be more difficult or at a personal cost to you, but you also know it's just the right thing to do in the face of adversity or whatever is the thing that you're facing. I also love Scout as the narrator. Her innocence, I think, is one of the things that adds a unique perspective to this story because, especially when you're talking about issues of race, kids don't get it. It doesn't make sense to them. There's no logical thing about racism. It's an emotion. It's pure pathos. It's emotion based on, I don't know, just a feeling rather than a fact. And so kids tear apart racism really quick. And that's one of the reasons Scout it's so important that she is the narrator, because as you face some of the situations you're faced with in the book, it logically doesn't make sense. That is the way that this book deals with the issue of race, I think, is good because it also doesn't just present things as black and white, good or bad. There's lots of shades of gray that it explores, and even though you read characters who are racist, you'll see they're not always terrible people. Sometimes they're just misguided, or they're caught up in the way that their society has always presented something to them. So it's definitely not making it sound like racism is good, because it's not. But there's a human element to people that sometimes we forget. We're quick to label, and we forget that there might be something behind the history of that person, and we sometimes look for differences rather than similarities. And I think this book tries to tackle the issue of race, especially for the time that it was written, in a way that humanizes it for everybody a little bit. My family was Southern. My grandpa moved here to Union Grove from Mississippi when he was 16 years old, and so probably not going to meet a more racist person than my great grandmother was. The things I heard her say cannot be repeated on this screen. But she was still a good great grandmother to me. I can't, you know what I mean? So I just see some of that nuance in this book, which is one of the reasons I enjoy it as well.
Yeah, I resonate with this because it's about a small town in the South, and I grew up in a small town. The author Harper Lee reminds me of my Aunt Sue, who was never had kids. She had health problems, but she was an extremely learned, brilliant woman, and she talked like this book is written. In the 1960s, she was a freedom rider, actually. She went down from Iowa to Mississippi to register African-American voters, just a small, with her Lutheran church, but she always wanted to do the right thing. And where I grew up in the small town, I think one great thing about small towns is you get to know people deeply, all kinds of people. And you get to know them, like I say, this book is kind of about a small town, so I can really resonate with that. There are a couple scenes, I don't want to give too much away, but there are a couple scenes that define this for me. There's a famous court trial in the middle where everyone knows Atticus Finch is going to lose. That's not going to be a spoiler. But at the end, when he leaves the courtroom alone, defeated, the African Americans are consigned to the balcony seats. They're not allowed down on the main floor of the courthouse. And actually, Jem and Scout, the narrator Scout, snuck into the church or into the courtroom to watch the trial, and they're on the balcony. And as their dad leaves, one of the African American men says, "Get up, kids, that's your daddy passed." And that really gets me because everyone recognizes what a towering moral figure he is, their father is. Another key scene for me comes near the end. I don't want to give anything away, but basically something really bad happens to the father of the woman who falsely accused the African American man. And Atticus says, "Well, I better start a court trial. I better figure out what happened." And his little daughter comes at the end of the novel and she says, "Dad, you got to let this go." He finally says, "She's right." So even though, what would Atticus do is a common theme in this, you also have the practical realities of what it's like to grow up in a small town during segregation and all the crazy characters that come and go in this. The other thing I want to talk about is the writing style. It takes a little bit of getting used to, which is why we're going to read the beginning for you. I would describe this as American Baroque or maybe small town Baroque. I've talked about what Baroque style is, light and dark, maybe more complex sentence structures, or at least a variety of words. Basically, it can be a difficult style, and instead of getting right to the point, she kind of beats around the bush. This could be off-putting until you kind of get her little wry sense of humor and her irony. She has enough respect for you as a reader that you'll figure this out. She's also a Southern writer at a time when life is leisurely, so she says, "Take your time, spend some time with me. I want to tell you a story." And if you treat it in that spirit, I think this book will pay off and will really stay with you. I've had the privilege of being able to teach it several times. I know Mrs. E has as well. Mm-hmm. And the more I think about it, I think it's a privilege to read this book and to share it with you. So we're going to read the beginning.
Harper Lee, too, was a huge introvert. I don't know if that Prezi that you had them go through goes over that at all, but no. She kept to herself. She was a very, very quiet, introverted person. She would not have struggled during this time to stay at home with the stay-at-home order. And she had one good friend, Truman Capote, who is also a famous writer. And the character of Dill is actually based off of Truman Capote. So there's other stuff with Harper Lee that
we will cover later.
Yeah. But
this is basically her story, if not in fact in spirit.
Yes.
So, all right. So what we're going to do is we're just going to read the first few pages for you. We're going to take turns reading paragraphs, and we are going to stop and discuss at the end of every paragraph. We'll probably stop frequently. You're welcome to read along in the book or just watch us. And the kind of analysis that we'll give right now is the kind of notes that I would, if I were to write an essay on this, these are the kind of notes that I'd write down and I would try to turn into an essay that could be presented when you introduce this to your parents, as I say, in writing. So, we all good? All right. Now, we have two different versions of the books that I've passed out, unfortunately. There's a dark kind of brown, and then the pink version. So I can't give you page numbers. We're going to go by chapters. In my book, I have this one, and it actually starts on page 3.
So does this one.
Okay, good. And but then the pages diverge. So we'll start on chapter 1. Okay. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed and Jem's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, that means calmed, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right. When he stood or walked, the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less so long as he could pass and punt. I'm going to pause, actually. I like this. You start right off with a little girl telling you about her brother and how he messed up his arm, but he didn't care as long as he could play football.
Yeah, which is a total kid thing to do. You're in the midst of like a big potential trial involving the whole entire town, and bigger ideas like racism. But it's like, my brother hurt his arm. And
He wanted to play football.
Just wanted to play football.
And how cool his thumb was at a weird angle.
Yeah, so it's first and foremost in our mind.
Yep.
When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintain that the Yules started it all, but Jem, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out.
So I hear a lot of names there that she's throwing out.
Yes.
Which, like I say, that's that kind of small town thing. She's like setting up an era of mystery already.
Yeah, and small towns have this mythology, this sort of everybody knows. It's never like written down, but everybody knows these things, and that's how she talks about it. Like, the Yules are the poor family, the poor white trash family in town, and you'll get to know a lot of the Yule members throughout the book. Dill is their friend who's kind of crazy and imaginative and has all these ideas, and then Boo Radley is this mysterious guy that nobody really knows about him, but everybody knows about him. And the idea of Boo Radley also brings an important point that we didn't bring up about the idea of empathy is huge in this book too, and the difference between empathy and sympathy, right? Because you can only sympathize with somebody if you've gone through that thing. So if you've lost a loved one and I've lost a loved one, I can sympathize. I know what that's like. Empathy comes from putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. So you haven't actually experienced that thing, and perhaps you can't. I can't live the life of a young black girl. I just can't. I don't have that background or experience, but I can empathize if I read. That's the power of reading, right? You can empathize, hear people's stories, understand their points of view. And Boo Radley is kind of tied in with the idea of empathy as we continue through the book as well. And
speaking of mysterious characters in town, Union Grove has people that we may or may not be related to that kind of wander the streets.
Yes.
We won't say any names. All right, we're on the third paragraph. I said if you wanted to take a broad view of the thing, it really began with Andrew Jackson. If General Jackson hadn't run the creeks up the creek, Simon Finch would never have paddled up the Alabama. And where would we be if he hadn't? We were far too old to settle an argument with a fist fight, so we consulted Atticus. Our father said we were both right.
You ever talk to a kid and they go way off on a tangent? Like, that's not related. Our son does that all the time. He'll, take a hard left, and it's something totally unrelated. He'll bring it up as related. That's kind of what Scout's doing here. It's like she's going... It's kind of related, but it's also kind of not. Being Southerners, it was a source of shame to some members of the family that we had no recorded ancestors on either side of the Battle of Hastings. All we had was Simon Finch, a fur-trapping apothecary from Cornwall, whose piety was exceeded only by his stinginess. In England, Simon was irritated by the persecution of those who called themselves Methodists at the hands of their more liberal brethren, and as Simon called himself a Methodist, he worked his way across the Atlantic to Philadelphia, thence to Jamaica, thence to Mobile, Alabama. and then up to St. Stephen's. Mindful of John Wesley's strictures on the use of many words in buying and selling, Simon made a pile practicing medicine. But in this pursuit he was unhappy, lest he be tempted into doing what he knew was not for the glory of God, as the putting on of gold and costly apparel. So Simon, having forgotten his teacher's dictum on the possession of human chattels, another word for slaves, bought 3 slaves, and with their aid established a homestead on the banks of the Alabama River, some 40 miles above St. Stephen's. He returned to St. Stephen's only once to find a wife, and with her established a line that ran high to daughters. Simon lived to an impressive age and died rich. So this is their family lore, right? This is how they came and settled. What is this homestead? The Finch family homestead. And, you probably have that in your own family where you know how you came to America or a certain line of people that did certain things. And that history is what she's establishing here for the Finch family, which was very important to Southerners and to just Americans at this time in general.
And the way she writes it has kind of an epic quality, I think. It was customary for the men in the family to remain on Simon's homestead, Finch's Landing, and make their living from cotton. The place was self-sufficient, modest in comparison with the empires around it. The landing nevertheless produced everything required to sustain life except ice, wheat, flour, and articles of clothing supplied by riverboats from Mobile.
So another important point here is this is a time when people, lived off of the fat of the land, so to speak, to take a line from Of Mice and Men. They lived off of what they could produce except for a few small things. It was not a consumerism society as we have now. Simon would have regarded with impotent fury the disturbance between the North and South, as it left his descendants stripped of everything but their land. Yet the tradition of living on the land remained unbroken until well into the 20th century, when my father, Atticus Finch, went to Montgomery to read law, and his younger brother went to Boston to study medicine. Their sister Alexandra was the Finch who remained at the landing. She married a taciturn man who spent most of his time lying in a hammock by the river, wondering if the trout lines were full.
Fishing all the time. When my father was admitted to the bar as being a lawyer, barrister, he returned to Macomb and began his practice. Macomb, some 20 miles east of Finch's Landing, was the county seat of Macomb County. Atticus's office in the courthouse contained little more than a hat rack, a spittoon, that's for chewing tobacco, so it's almost like the frontier even then, a checkerboard, and an unsullied code of Alabama. I'm going to interrupt. Unsullied means undirtied. So basically, if nobody touches the Code of Alabama, that means deals happen like the Good Old Boys Network through agreements rather than opening up books. It sounds like I say, frontier times. His first 2 clients were the last 2 persons hanged in the Macomb County Jail. Atticus had urged them to accept the state's generosity in allowing them to plead guilty to second-degree murder and escape with their lives, but they were Haverfords. In Macomb County, a name synonymous with jackass. The Haverfords had dispatched Macomb's, dispatch means killed, by the way, it's a nice way, had dispatched Macomb's leading blacksmith in a misunderstanding arising from the alleged wrongful detention of a mare, a horse, were imprudent enough to do it in the presence of 3 witnesses and insisted that the son of a bitch had it coming to him was a good enough defense for anybody. They persisted in pleading not guilty to first-degree murder, so there was nothing much Atticus could do for his clients except be present at their departure, an occasion that was probably the beginning of my father's profound distaste for the practice of criminal law.
During his first 5 years in Macomb, Atticus practiced economy more than anything. For several years thereafter, he invested his earnings in his brother's education. I also think that kind of shows something, I never really picked up on that before, but he gave his money to his brother so his brother could get an education. I think that's because we played the game of life, and in the game of life, last night you have to choose the career path or the college path, and then you pay a little more money up front, and then you make more money in the end. I cleaned house. I won. Okay, I was a doctor. Anyways.
Not a teacher.
Yeah, I think that shows Atticus's altruistic nature, that he gave his money early on to his brother to further his own education. John Hale Finch was 10 years younger than my father and chose to study medicine at a time when cotton was not worth growing. But after getting Uncle Jack started, Atticus derived a reasonable income from the law. He liked Macomb. He was Macomb County born and bred. He knew his people. They knew him. And because of Simon Finch's industry, Atticus was related by blood or marriage to nearly every family in town.
What does that sound like?
It's rude. I'm from Union Grove. That's rude.
Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop, grass grew on the sidewalks, the courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow, it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. Mrs. E., what do you think of that writing?
I personally am a fan. I love the descriptiveness of it. I can feel the town and its slowness and see it. It's a classic example of show, don't tell. She shows all these different ways that the town was slowed down. And I think, especially when it was go, 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 and we're always going so fast, I always kind of craved a lifestyle that was a little more slow. We're kind of getting that now, even though we're still working all the time. But
On Sunday.
Here we are on Sunday recording videos nonstop. But it seems like a bygone era that we no longer have access to because our society has become so busy.
People, you got the next one.
People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. An allusion, of course, to
FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president during the Depression. He says, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." We lived on the main residential street in town, Atticus Gemini plus Calpurnia, our cook. Gemini found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read to us, treated us with courteous detachment.
I think it's worth noting that Calpurnia is black. It doesn't tell you it, but
she doesn't notice.
Yeah,
it's not an issue.
For you as readers, I think
yeah,
it helps you visualize the character and her place in society as
well. She basically raises the kids.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to read the next one?
Yeah.
Calpurnia was something else again. She was all angles and bones. She was nearsighted. She squinted. Her hand was wide as a bed slat and twice as hard. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave as well as Jem when she knew he was older, and calling me home when I wasn't ready to come. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jem was born, and I had felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember.
Our mother died when I was 2, so I never really felt her presence. She was a Graham from Montgomery. Atticus met her when he was first elected to the state legislature. He was middle-aged then. She was 15 years his junior. Jem was the product of their first year of marriage. 4 years later, I was born. And 2 years later, our mother died from a sudden heart attack. They said it ran in her family. I did not miss her, but I think Jem did. He remembered her clearly. And sometimes in the middle of a game, he would sigh at length, then go off and play by himself behind the car house. When he was like that, I knew better than to bother him.
When I was almost 6 and Jem was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within calling distance of Calpurnia, were Mrs. Henry Lafayette DeBose's house, 2 doors to the north of us, and the Radley place, 3 doors to the south. So this is essentially when you'd go outside, this is like where you could go and not get in trouble. You had to be within calling distance of your parents. When I was growing up, we couldn't cross Main Street. That was like our boundary. Like as long as I grew up on 71st Drive, so as long as we were kind of within these couple of blocks, as we were free to roam and play, we didn't have to really check in with our parents. And that was really since I was like 5 or 6, pretty young. I don't know that kids play like that so much anymore, so maybe you did. But that was always my boundary. You can't cross Main Street. That was like the dangerous road, right? Mrs. Henry Lafayette DeBose's house, 2 doors to the north. Sorry, I already read that. We were never tempted to break them. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, the mere description of whom was enough to make us behave for days on end. Mrs. DeBose was plain hell. You'll meet her later.
That was the summer Dill came to us. All right, we'll let you guys read the end of chapter 1. All the assignments are on Google Classroom. Stay up on it, guys.
See ya.